Hi, I'm Tom Stephenson and welcome to Lecture 8C of our Site Management course. In today's class, we're going to be reviewing waste and environmental management, sustainable construction practices, more of the certifications and how that integrates with site management, and what is commissioning? What exactly do we mean by commissioning, and what's the processes involved? So really in the chapter, which is chapter 13 of our site management textbook, we reviewed these areas, and this is part of this lecture. And I've added a bit more on the commissioning process because that's becoming a really big deal. Sustainable design and construction already is a big deal. And usually the attachment when we're talking about ICI, it usually has to do with LEED is the most popular certification program. If we get into residential construction, Energy Star, Net Zero certification, R2000, they would be some other ones. There's also Passive House certification. There's a lot of different energy certification programs. But I think LEED would, like the textbook uses, I think correctly so, is probably the dominant one, particularly in the condo market, commercial building sector, for sure. So a little bit about waste management. We need to consider, we talked about waste and the 8 areas of waste. Well, there's also garbage waste, which is a big problem as well, and hazards and potential environmental impacts. And if we're talking about LEED certifications too, we have to be documenting how we're disposing of things, where it came from. There's a lot of requirements that come into place. So it has become a major area of concern on projects, and it is becoming more and more common that we are ensuring that we minimize waste and we recycle as much as possible. And there's been a lot of regulatory authorities being involved and municipalities being involved with reducing waste and making sure that what waste does go out is segregated so that it can be repurposed, recycled. So, some of these tie into waste management, communication, education plan, evaluation, and there's specific topics on waste. So early involvement, opportunity to build realistic specifications for reducing waste. Certification plans can tie into this because then they have very, very specific requirements. You achieve points based on how well you achieve those requirements and how well you validate them through documentation. We can really look at how waste is going to be occur, when it's going to occur, and how we're going to deal with it. And obviously waste management also ties into ensuring that we have a clean and safe site, so we make sure that it's being taken care of properly. We can think of that we also can have things stolen from the job site. You can think of that as a waste. Waste due to operations, as we've said. We talked about the 8 areas of waste in lean construction. If you don't remember that, go back to one of the earlier lectures where I discuss the 8 wastes known as downtime. The first letter spells the various areas of waste. But there is a lot of, you can sort of see where the waste comes from. Interesting that this was utilized from a Canadian source, Ontario, given that our book is US based. So this one's close to home, but where most of the waste on construction projects come from. A lot of waste in lumber. Well, I'm not surprised about paper, cardboard. You just have to think of stuff you get delivered from Amazon. You got a box, it's a box inside a box, right? And that's a lot of waste. I know fills up my bins pretty quickly when you start opening boxes of boxes. So there's a lot of waste in packaging that goes on. That's going to be addressed at some point in the future, I think, with retailers and delivery agents and things of that nature. It may be easier to package it and repackage it, then people don't know what's inside the box. You're leaving on somebody's porch and that sort of thing. So there's logic behind it, but it still is leaving you add up all the tens of millions of boxes that are going in the garbage. That's not great. So that's part of a systems problem. But then there's also the disposal problem and ensuring that it's going in the right box, so at least whatever cardboard was produced is going to be recycled. Lumber, high amounts, and I think in earlier pictures in the earlier lectures you've seen where I've shown waste strewn about. I think in last week's lecture when we talked about subcontractors and safety, and you saw the piles of wood and garbage that are around. Definitely lots in that area. Interesting, not a lot of concrete waste. Concrete's very expensive and you don't like to dispose excess amounts. So you usually put a lot of care into your calculations of concrete, so you don't order too much extra. You order enough extra, but not very much extra. So because you put a lot more planning in that one, it takes up a relatively small amount when you consider how much concrete we use in construction. So there's an example of one that's kind of done pretty well. So you get an idea in a sense where the waste is predominant, and you could also use the Pareto principle and look at, well, where's the low-hanging fruit here? I see these ones as being the low-hanging fruit. This one probably is about the 20 of the 80, if you want to look at it, right? This one's close to it. Just using Pareto's law from our quality control quality assurance lecture 9A. So we want to make sure that we document how waste is generated and plan for dealing with the disposal and use. This may be mandated if you're doing a certification program. Also looking at, it's very municipal specific. So usually if you're in Toronto, it's Toronto. If you're in Brampton, it's Brampton. How you can dispose of things, where you can dispose of things. There's a variety of issues that you need to address. And some of them have environmental impacts. Some of them have strict regulatory impacts. You know, how do we dispose of asbestos? Where does asbestos go? Last time I was looking into that, there was a special dump that was just outside Ottawa that asbestos from Toronto was going to. So there are those elements that you have to make sure you're satisfying regulatory requirements. Stormwater pollution prevention, preventing stormwater runoff. Also, when we think about waste and pollution and environmental impacts, there's specific regulatory requirements about that, and making sure that you're satisfying the regulatory requirements, but also satisfying sustainability requirements or green requirements, depending on what you are trying to satisfy. And I think I've stated it before, but I define green building as meeting building code and regulatory requirements, usually by around 20-25%, and sustainability requirements are above and beyond that, so that you're affecting and you're not impacting future generations in a negative way with what you're doing today. So certification programs, there are lots of other certification programs out there. Most are going to have, the big part of the certification program is getting certified, having the documentation in place. I've had a lot of consultants and that I've talked to over the years, and they've said, you know, it's so expensive to manage the LEED certification process. We could have done so much more things with that money. But the problem is, how do you know the building met those certification problems? How do you substantiate it? That's because otherwise it could turn into this sort of greenwashing, where somebody says something but they're lying. It's not really that. They're just using the lingo and they're trying to use it as a marketing tool. So that's why certification programs are very popular, is that it's saying, no, this was certified. It actually happened, and they have the documentation to prove it. So it's factual. It's making something that could be changed and taken advantage of to making it factual. So building certification and contract documents, you know, it could look LEED certification goal. The contractor acknowledges that the owner intends to seek a minimum LEED Gold certification for the project. Owner's responsibility: provide the contractor with all the construction documentation, design drawings relevant and necessary to achieve Gold. Contractor's scope of work shall perform in scope of work in accordance with accepted green building principles and practices, including those associated with LEED. the particular system and in a manner consistent with the owner's goal of attaining minimum LEED Gold certification. Subcontractors, the contractor shall engage subcontractors who have knowledge of and experience with such green building principles and practices, and the contractor shall include a corresponding obligation in the subcontract with each of the regarding proper conduct of their proportion of the work. Damages. The contractor shall be liable for all damages and costs incurred by the owner for failure to obtain, there's some punitive damages there, of the performance. However, the limit of contractor's liability shall not exceed $50,000. Performance bonus, incentive, extrinsic reward. The contractor shall receive a monetary bonus equal to 0.75% of the final contract price. So there's an incentive there. Depending on the size of the project, that might be quite a sizable incentive. You know, if it's $1 million project, that would be $100 million project, that'd be $750,000. Specialty and subcontractors' role in waste management. So they need to, they're really going to be integrated. They can make you or sink you. And depending on their specialty, if it's wastewater management, that could make you or sink you, as I said. So the downside in those cases usually is bigger than the upside. Makes the team a potential leader in sustainable practices. And it is, if you really get advanced at this, it gives you a competitive advantage. Indoor air quality, IAQ, is an important aspect, not just if it's a LEED project, but other projects as well. Buildings have to be flushed out and checked and verified that the indoor air quality meets a certain standard. So that requires planning and scheduling. You got to ensure that somebody's not laying down some sort of floor that's off-gassing a certain fumes, because for sure it's going to fail. So you have to make sure the building is flushed out, and then it's tested to see if it's meeting indoor air quality standards. And there's specific requirements around that in LEED buildings, but also most buildings that are being commissioned today also have to meet pretty stringent requirements around indoor air quality. Many construction practices contribute to poor air quality after occupancy, and that's, you've heard of buildings perhaps with sick building syndrome, you know, where people just feel down or exhausted or not that well. And a lot of times it's that you don't have a good air exchange in the building, a good filtration process, and there's a lot of off-gassing by the materials that were used that maybe had high chemical content, that some of the chemicals had negative health implications. So that's why fresh air systems and HVAC systems that are tested and balanced properly to ensure the flow of fresh air in the building is important. And that materials that have been used have been designed in such a way, that's why a lot of LEED buildings, etc., they'll have specific requirements around the paints that are used, the carpets that are used, the materials that are used with regards to health impacts. Commissioning is the process of making sure that the building meets its intended design values. So designers have a certain design intent, and now you're testing the building to make sure that it meets those requirements. And commissioning, also like LEED, also like closeout, as we'll talk in another lecture, needs to be really started early in the process. And you really have to be involved with it. Now, some of it depends on the type of contract that you have. If it's a design bid build, well, you can't very well as a contractor be involved in it before construction. However, if it's like an integrated project delivery or a construction management contract, you can be right in at the very initial stages of it. So it depends on the contract type where as a contractor you can become involved. But whatever stage you become involved with commissioning, you better get involved as soon as possible, because otherwise it's going to make closing out the project very difficult. The real testing and balancing aspects usually comes towards the end of the project. You can't test and balance something that's not installed. You can't check indoor air quality when you haven't even got the finishes in yet in the building, right? So, well, you can, but it's not going to tell you much. So you have to plan that process, and you have to make sure that you're complying all the way through so that things pass. You got to know what the requirements are at the early stages. Going back to what we discussed earlier in the course with various meetings, you have to have meetings because there will be a third-party commissioning agent on more complex buildings that the client hires. And they are hired by the client to come check to make sure that what you're doing meets the design intent. So you need to find out earlier exactly what are their requirements so that you can ensure that you meet those requirements and it passes. You don't want to have surprises near the end. It's going to delay the finish of the project. And clients do not give you a gold star for being on time 90% of the project. All they remember is you were late at the end. So getting occupancy for sure, and part of that is the commissioning process too. The regulatory authorities have to pass anything that has life safety systems involvement, sprinkler systems, fire alarm systems, etc. So contractor needs to provide all the documentation required. They have to gather the proper information from vendors and subcontractors during the process. So this gives you a pretty good idea of the timelines, establish the owner's project requirements, basically develop the basis of design, assemble the CX, that's usually the abbreviation for commissioning team, develop preliminary commissioning plan, establish commissioning budget, incorporate design and pre-construction commissioning activities into CM, GM, subcontractor scope of work, finalize commissioning plan. So if it's a construction management project, construction manager may be in this stage, or they may come in this stage. If it's a design bid build, you're probably not coming in until this particular stage, which again, there's less that you can do, but you need to make sure that the plan and what the requirements are satisfied so you can incorporate that into your baseline schedule and adjust as you go along. All right, so during construction and testing and balancing, it's going to happen more towards the end of the project, nearing close out. And so then post-construction, generate initial commissioning reports, check as it goes along. You want to, even once the client moves in, they want to make sure the building's functioning as it was tested, because things can go out of balance, etc. So it's kind of this whole life cycle of commissioning timelines. Generally for the contractors, you have this area here, but it depends on the contract type. You might be involved in the whole process. P3 project, you're going to be involved in this whole process from start to end. Private-public partnerships. So it should involve a schedule. I don't have the link lines indicated here, but you need to detail out the type of work that's going to be done during the commissioning process and the timelines. So it has to have enough detail that you can monitor it, ensure also that any of this work is not going to interfere with other work that's going on. In this case, this is just an example of commissioning just only for the electrical side. I ran into this with a Elliston presentation that they did a while back, and it was with a Cisco partnership, and it kind of just gives you an idea of what we're dealing with building systems and how there's been a convergence of building systems, and it's an ongoing convergence that's going on where different systems talk to each other, and things are advancing further and further. You can just look at home technology now, where people have a doorbell, a Nest doorbell, and they can monitor if somebody's at the door. They don't even have to be at home. They could be in Europe, and they can see somebody's at the door, and they can even talk to them. So integration of that, integration of alarm systems, integration of your furnace and heating systems, and that's just in residential. So you can only imagine looking at the various systems here that get integrated as well, and how that can come into being as well, whether we're talking about closed circuit TVs, or whether we're talking about security, or whether we're talking about air handling units and boilers and chillers, air conditioning units. They all integrate into a communication system that facilities will manage. And this is where the future is kind of going to with building information modeling, which is the different levels, 3D, the clash detection interferences, 4D, the schedule management, 5D, the estimating, and 6D, enterprise applications and integration into a database, the complete as-built of the building and the building systems. So it has become a much, much more complex area, and this is an area that contractors are struggling with because of the complexity and ensuring that it tests and passes and it doesn't end up delaying the project. Things that happen, the final inspection processes that happen near the end of a project, they're kind of the things that make me a little bit nervous, because that's the thing that can stop you from opening on time. Even George Brown, as I go back to e-building, an example when I was managing the project for technology, one of the big issues we had was the computer labs in e-building. They tested out at Cat 4, and that's basically a measurement of how much data and information will flow through. And they were supposed to test at Cat 6, and if we accepted it, we were going to be stuck with it, so we didn't want to accept it. So that meant we had to reschedule the labs, that the students had double the lab time the last 7 weeks, and they had to rerun the lines. Those types of things occur, right? Commissioning is, and it's a specialized area. There's usually on large project, there'll be an M&E coordinator that'll be heavily involved in the commissioning process that will look after that part, because it's such a big job to make sure that you're properly integrating the various systems, and when there's issues, you've got people that are contracted to fill those gaps. LEED 2, again, we have to do that planning process early, so we want to make sure that we've done it early with LEED as well. We got to know where the points are coming from, where the certification points are coming from, and they're identified. We've got to make sure we gather the documentation as the project proceeds. I don't want to go chasing after subcontractors for documentation when they did work a year ago and they've gone. I want to get the documentation when they're there. That's the easiest and best way. So that means you got to be on top of it, and that means you got to be proactive about it. That means you got to know what you got to get and where the points are identified in the general requirements, usually of the specifications section. So waste management, job site management, certifications and commissioning, all important aspects, and sort of leading up to some of the things that we need to do to be able to close out our project, to run our projects effectively. And really it all goes back to the beginning, starting early in the planning process, so you're proactive instead of reactive. Okay, so that's what I wanted to discuss in this short lecture, and hopefully it's making some sense. And I just wanted to wish everybody a wonderful day. Tom Stephenson signing off for now.